let's start at the very beginning, shall we, as the song in the movie goes.
It's a very good place to start, yes.
What's the earliest memory that you have of either a movie or a performance that opened up the world of entertainment to you as a possibility for you and your life?
My grandfather actually was a sign painter in Chicago. I'm from Chicago originally, and my whole family still lives there. And my grandfather actually used to, by hand, go and paint billboards. And he actually painted a lot of advertisements for companies, but also he painted a lot of movie billboards. And when I was very, very young, like I can remember being 5 or 6, I would see his sketches of the billboards that he would go and then paint in large scale and on the south side of Chicago. And then my dad also is a huge comedy fan and actually loves Laurel and Hardy and the Three Stooges and Abbott and Costello. And I remember watching Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, probably is the movie that I remember from when I was a kid, watching over and over and over. Again, nothing was available back then, and you watched it when it was on the late night movie or Channel 9, where I was from in Chicago. So those black and white comedy films from, my dad's time that he loved to share with me, they, I think, made a huge impression on me.
What happened in your mind when you saw that? Could you relate yourself to that, or was it simply the sheer joy of watching those comedians?
I loved those comedians, and I to this day think they are, timeless comedies, those films. But I also loved watching those films with my dad, and he laughed at them, and I'm not sure I always knew exactly what the jokes were or why they were funny. I think I got some of the jokes and he got the other ones, but I think the things that we overlapped with were the things that I actually loved. And in some ways, my dad was a truck driver, and so he would drive across the country during the week, and so I'd only see him on the weekends. And that time that we would watch TV together in those films actually was the moment that we actually connected. And so I think that's why I love, I watch our films a lot in an audience with a full audience, and I love watching how parents and kids or adults and young people respond to our films in different ways at the same time.
You mentioned you were born in Chicago, Illinois, and brought up there. You're one of 7.
I am the oldest of 7.
Oh, the oldest of 7.
Yes.
Well, you and I have in common 7. I'm one of 7 as well, but I'm bang in the middle, so that makes us very different people. Were you the performer of the family?
I really wasn't. I was the oldest, so I was probably the bossiest of the family. But I wasn't like a extroverted person, probably the opposite of that in some ways. But I always wanted to, study performance or music or something along those lines. But I have many other sisters and brothers who are far more performing than I am.
Well, that's interesting that you then went on to the School of Theatre Arts at Wesleyan University. Mm-hmm. Why was that? Was acting the thing that you were going to do?
I studied music and theater, and I studied performance. Even back then I thought, okay, I'll be an actor, but I'll be an actor and then I'll have my own company or direct movie. Like I thought of acting as a way of getting to the other side of the camera or to the other side of theater.
So the other side was always...
Producing and directing was something I always thought I was interested in.
Okay. And there were early parts, though. I've read in one document there was a part in Godspell.
I did Godspell in a production in New York in 1987, right after I graduated, a few years after I graduated from college. And that was a great experience for me.
What part?
I sang All Good Gifts. So the part in the original show is called Lamar, but we all used our own names in the production that I did, as I think is mostly, I played Lamar. I played myself. Some of those friends are some of my closest friends. And actually, interestingly, I met Stephen Schwartz during Godspell, and then Stephen Schwartz did The Prince of Egypt.
Yes.
And also now is doing a movie for us that comes out in a couple of years. Actually, we're doing a Bollywood musical that Stephen Schwartz and A.R. Rahman are collaborating on for DreamWorks now.
Oh, fantastic! So the alumni are getting together.
Yes, yeah.
So if I'm to draw a map of your life so far, it takes me from Chicago across to New York, and then we do this big arc across to LA. So how do we get from production in Godspell in New York to production assistant in Los Angeles?
I had been doing shows and was doing okay doing that. But I had never actually been to Los Angeles. I was a hardcore New Yorker. I'm never leaving New York.
Yes.
And I had a really close friend, and her husband had lived in Los Angeles, and they were very good friends of mine. I know them from Chicago, and then one of them, she was in Godspell also with me. And I was going to visit her in LA, and I was on the plane on the way there. And on the way there, I just had a premonition that I would just move to Los Angeles. So what was supposed to be a vacation ended up, I got there, I landed, I said, I'm moving here. She was like, you're crazy. Why? Why are you moving here? I was like, I just know I'm supposed to move here. And I spent the entire time I was there looking for an apartment, quitting my job in New York, letting go of my apartment in New York, changing everything. And that was November, it was Thanksgiving, November 25th of that year.
You decided to do this Thanksgiving.
I decided on Thanksgiving, and I was moved to Los Angeles in January.
Do you often follow your intuition in that way?
I do, actually. I follow my intuition.
There's an inner voice that speaks to you about what's the right path to take.
Yeah, when it does, I do listen to it. I don't second guess it, because I think you could worry yourself into a circle, sometimes. Mm-hmm. And of course, I just thought, well, if it doesn't work out, I could move back. I mean, it wasn't, New York is still there. If I want to move back now, I can still go back to New York, and I love New York. But it just felt like the right thing to do at that time.
I want your lack of stress levels. A production assistant on the celebrated Pocahontas. I think, if I'm right, that was the first sort of real job you got there in this kind of industry?
Yes, I was in LA probably for a few years before I got that job.
Okay.
And I had been, I had, some basic office skills. I had been a temp at Capitol Records. I worked in the Capitol Records building, the famous Capitol Records building, when I first moved to Los Angeles. But I always loved animation. And at some point I just said, I have to, and I was still acting a little bit, doing commercials and episodic stuff. But I said, if I want to be a producer, I should go work for a producer. So back in those days, you used to call the hotline at the studio. So every studio had a number that you could call, and you would dial the phone. No, I think there was already push buttons by then, but and you could listen to what the jobs were that were available.
Oh, really?
And you could press the button to go to the next job if it wasn't the right job, and then you could drop your resume off for a job. And there were jobs available at Disney Animation working for a producer on the movie that ended up becoming Mulan. And I got an interview for that job, and I met with that woman, and she said, I'm not going to hire you because you won't stay with me long enough, and this movie's going to be 3.5 years long. But the producer of Pocahontas is looking for a job, for an assistant. You should go meet with them. And I met with him, and he hired me, and I started 2 weeks later. And that was the movie was about 1.5 years left of production. And I got to work at the very end on Pocahontas, and I got to go to all the previews, and I took all the notes and was in the room with, incredibly talented. This is back when Jeffrey was gone already. Jeffrey was off to start his own thing by that point. But Tom Schumacher, Peter Schneider, Stephen Schwartz, Alan Menken, everybody was at these previews. And I got to watch and witness the creative process with everyone. And they made some pretty big changes to the movie through that preview process. And I got to be a part of that. And it's a kind of an interesting thing because it's such a part of my life now, responding to films and audiences.
Was there an aha moment for you in that job where you thought, yes, this is what I need to do?
The minute I got there, I knew that I wanted to do that. And I had always loved animation. I was a big kind of nerdy groupie of Walt Disney and used to keep track of every Walt Disney short that I had ever seen. Again, before they were available on VHS or anything, I used to watch them on the Mickey Mouse Club, reruns of the Mickey Mouse Club, which used to be on at 5:30 in the morning in Chicago. So I'd get up in the morning so I could see the short that was on the Mickey Mouse Club, and I would highlight it in a book that I had of all the shorts that had ever been made at the Disney studio. So I was kind of like trying to make sure I'd seen them all. So yeah, big nerd. Anyway, so when I got the job at Disney, all of my friends and my family said, of course, this is a perfect place for you to go work. And then And
That's
then,
nice.
yeah.
My memory is that Pocahontas was part of that Disney Renaissance period that saw there was the real revival of large scale feature animation, and particularly at the Disney House. That's correct?
They had already had great success with Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah, that's right.
Pocahontas, I think, was the next movie after that, and Lion King was also in production at the same time. And I think Lion King, I think I'm remembering this correctly, but yeah, it was definitely after Beauty and the Beast. The creative energy at the studio was unbelievable, and Lion King was still yet to come. And there was and then there was also, Hunchback and Hercules and Treasure Planet and all these other films were already in production. So it was a massive operation back then.
And how did the transition to DreamWorks come about?
Well, nobody would hire me at Disney after I worked on Pocahontas. I didn't get a job there. I mean, I interviewed for a bunch of different jobs in a bunch of different departments. But a good friend of mine had gone to work at DreamWorks, and she got me an interview. And I was lucky enough to be hired as a production assistant in the production office on Prince of Egypt. And I think I was like the 45th person hired at the studio.
That's a nice number to remember.
I think I remember that because the person who was 44th reminds me of that all the time.
I love these stories in particular, particularly from people who are in celebrated and, let's be frank, very powerful roles, because I know there are people sitting in this room and some students as well who are thinking, how do you get there? How exactly does it happen? And in a sense, you've described that arc very well, which is it happens just through continuing to knock on the door, and it doesn't happen with the first hire or nor the second nor the third, although you might be lucky and it might, but perseverance and persistence and believing in yourself has to be a part of it, doesn't it?
And working really hard. I mean, I think and again, I don't know that I banged any doors down. I was very lucky to get the job at DreamWorks because it was a magical time at the company, and it was startup, and there were so many opportunities. Now, mind you, I was a 30-year-old PA. And so I had a whole career before that and had done a lot of other things and had been around a lot of, so I was, my peers who had similar jobs to me in other departments, I was, 6 to 10 years older than they were. And it was, that was hard. That part of that was hard, but I was willing to do that and wanted to do that because I knew if I could get in, on the ground floor of something like that, and if I could work hard, there would be opportunities that would present themselves, and they did.
Let's talk about DreamWorks. Tell us how the DreamWorks Animation Studio works. Do you have a permanent team of in-house animators?
We have, there's about 2,200 people who work at DreamWorks. And, I think the people who come to work at the studio really, for the most part, come there for a career. In terms of, animators, the people who actually do the animation, there are, I think, 120 people who actually do the character animation. But the artist community of that 2,200 is about 1,600 people. So it's really, as an environment, it's full of artists. I mean, you walk around the studio, and yes, there are people who work in human resources and technology and marketing and corporate type functions, but it's really a very artistic environment. And I believe for the most part, people really come there to make a career of it. And so people come right out of school. And many of the people who came at the same time that I came in trainee programs or in apprenticeships or came right from college. And they are today our directors and our production designers and our heads of animation, and they've grown at the studio and brought their talents to multiple roles over time.
Is the animation and the artistic community around animation, is it a very transient and migratory population? Are they moving from project to project, place to place, or in your case at DreamWorks, do they stay?
I think they stay for the most part. I mean, animation. And then there's a huge visual effects community as well, both in Northern and Southern California. The visual effects community tends to be what I would call more transient because it's a very much a hire, and then once the jobs are over, people leave and go to the next job, project by project. We've been lucky enough at DreamWorks to have a pipeline that has had films in it so that people can go from project to project within the studio. It's not that people don't leave because they might want to go and pursue an opportunity on the outside, but we have a pretty consistent workforce and people do love working there. And as long as the opportunities are there and the type of movies they want to work on. And I think the great thing about DreamWorks is they actually have choices as well. You know, we have more than one film in production at a time. And so people actually can look ahead and go, I'd really love to work on that. And we are most times able to accommodate that.
And what must also be very attractive, and this leads to my next question, I think a really important discussion for us this evening, is that there's no house style at DreamWorks, which must be enormously attractive to people working in that field because they're not doing the same thing over and over, and because their own individuality and creativity must be a part of it. Talk to me about that. Because that's clearly, from everything I've read that you've said, a very important part of the ethos of DreamWorks. No house style.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you've really kind of put your finger on, I think, what differentiates us from perhaps other studios is that our goal is to make different kinds of movies. So tell different kinds of stories and create looks and images for those stories that actually serve those stories but are unique. And so we're asking everybody to come to the table every time, and we're going to tell a story about a dog who adopts a boy, or we're going to tell a story about a boy who finds a dragon and changes the world, or we're going to tell a story about 4 New York zoo animals that get shipwrecked onto Madagascar. What is the animation style? What is the look? What is the kind of storytelling tone? How do we want to shoot the movie? Not how do we make this like our last movie, but how do we make this its own special, unique thing? And when you're asking people to do that, it's both really, really hard, I think, because creating something new is really, really challenging. But I think it challenges people and it makes them bring then their best work because you're asking them to do something that hasn't been seen yet. And so therefore, whether it's the artists themselves or the technology that is required to tell those stories, everyone's working together to crack that somewhat uncrackable problem.
And also, it's extremely brave in a sense because the thing of the studio picture has always been its recognizability, whether you're talking about the MGM style or even the Hammer horror style, or in particular the Disney style. You just have to see in the opening credits, I'm watching a Disney movie. What was the thinking behind that? Was there a sense of trepidation about taking that kind of open, creative approach to every film having its own look?
I'm trying to think about, how that happened. I think a lot of it is how we started as a studio. We have a studio in Southern California, which is about 1,600 people. And then we have in Northern California, PDI, we have another almost 500 people there. And PDI started as a visual effects studio that did commercials. And as a CG studio, DreamWorks started as a traditional animation studio. We made traditionally animated films, and a lot of people came from Amblimation, which was Steven Spielberg's company in Europe. So we brought a whole bunch of people over from Europe or came from Disney or other studios. And I think that amalgamation of those two groups of people all working together, we didn't have a bunch of people who all went to college together. We didn't have a bunch of people who all had worked together on one movie and then kind of splintered out to make other films. We actually had a lot of different people with a lot of different points of views from all over the world. And so I believe we kind of instinctively created a process in a studio that would bring the best out of them. And I think if we had tried to make all of those people make the same movie, they probably would have rebelled against us, for one thing. But I think it wouldn't have been the right fit. I think we started to see very quickly that, wow, those types of artists, they really are great at this. And this group of artists here. And I think that allowed for diversity. The diversity of the people allowed for diversity in the work.
So story first or imagery first when it comes to the idea of the next project, the next film?
It's a little bit like the chicken and egg question sometimes. Story is, of course, really, really important, but we tell stories with pictures. And so, a lot of people will say to me, oh, why don't you just, write the script and get the script great before we start, doing visual exploration on the film. Well, the visual exploration that we do often is the most inspiring thing to the writers and the storyboard artists. And so I inherently believe you cannot have one without the other. We make films that are made of pictures. We make that's what we make. We do it. And the art is such a part of the story. And so I believe that the earlier you can start the two things working hand in hand in a very small, protected way, the better result you'll get.
How about we have a look at How to Train Your Dragon here? What do you think? I think that's because I know you've selected a number of sequences we're going to look at this evening, and this one's particularly important to you, and I think fits nicely into our conversation right now. Tell us why.
Yeah, this is a scene where Hiccup and Toothless bond in How to Train Your Dragon, and I think it actually is just the strength of it is what animation does so brilliantly, which is there really are no words. It's really a beautiful piece of music and animation, and it's the artwork and an animator and a designer and a production designer and someone who controlled the lighting created a mood and a feeling and created something so truthful and so beautiful and so emotional, but it really is something that was made, every moment of it was planned, although it has a spontaneous feel to it. So I just love it because it is so truthful.
So we have there that lovely conjunction of story and character and what we were talking about before, and you saying how important it is that these two elements come together very early on and very closely. So how does that work? Are your writers different people to your animators? Are they sometimes the same people? How closely do they work?
We work with writers who write live action scripts, and the script for us really is a starting point. It's a foundation, and you need to work a lot of things out in outlines and treatments, and eventually a script. And then that script becomes something that we work with our visual artists and our storyboard artists and our animators on, and it's very much like workshopping material. We could take a scene or a joke or a moment or a character and go over it, hundreds of times in the storyboarding process, and eventually in how we shoot it and how we animate it in order to find that exact right execution of it. So we have writers and then storyboard artists, and then the visual development department is working to build the world and create the characters, and our animators are working with our designers to make sure that the characters that are being designed are animatable and actually can come to life in a way that they can. So it's a very iterative and collaborative process.
I was going to say the collaboration is intense, and this is, I'm not wanting to move into a HR department here, but you actually do need to have not only creative people, but people who can work together well, and not all creative people can do that.
No, you're right.
Go on, tell.
Well, it's. I think people. I think people come to the movie, and everybody has such a strong vision for their part that they bring to it, and I actually believe that collaboration and sometimes that conflict that comes into the creative collaboration is really good. I think it's actually good because people are pushing each other and having the right kind of conversations, and people don't always agree. But I know that when they don't agree, everyone is always coming from the best place, which is they want to do a great job. And so if people are fighting or disagreeing because they're passionate, that's a fine argument to have.
And we were speaking earlier before we joined you here this evening, and I got a sense from just something you alluded to about how lengthy this process can be, but how many versions there might be and how many reworkings of a gag or a moment or a scene, and the reworkings seem to be potentially endless in order to get it just right.
Yeah, it is. I think that probably is the hardest thing for people because we're reaching for a very high level of execution, and I think we're also reaching for a very high level of success. And the process is such that you work in chunks of the movie and you're watching it over and over and over and over and over. And so, my just another slightly personal story. Like my dad tells the same jokes over and over and over. Like over and over and over, and I love them every time.
Yes.
And I think that's why I'm actually perfect for animation, because I can watch the scenes or go to the screenings or go to editorial, and we're watching the funniest thing ever, and everyone else is like this, like miserable, because I've seen it 1,000 times, and I just still can experience it and love it for what I think the audience will experience the first time they see it. But it is that reworking period. It's the fine line. Like, how do you do that, and how do you workshop something to make it great, but also make it feel spontaneous and not take the life out of it? I think there can be an overworking thing that can happen sometimes.
Yeah.
So it is a very important thing that the directors and producers, we all have to guard that.
And are you the guy who sort of comes in over the top from time to time and can see that process is either staying on track or coming off the rails?
One of my sayings is like, let's just fix it. Like, let's just fix it enough, because sometimes you can get to something and suddenly you're doing all these notes and you hear all these notes coming and you're like, it's not broken. It actually is really, really great. Let's not unravel what's really great about this right now. There are things that we need to work on and things we need to improve in this, but sometimes that endless ability to work on the material and to improve it and to fix it can sometimes have you tear apart the thing that actually is great about it in the first place.
And I want to get to the dangers as well as the advantages of the technologies that you're allowed at the moment that I'm sure might get you to that position of being snowblind in just a moment. But just zooming up if we can and looking over at this process that you're right in the middle of that you're describing here. And I can imagine that every story would sort of dictate, if you like, its own approach and process. Is there a guiding principle nonetheless for every work that you produce that would be a uniform principle, if you like, that can be applied to all of the works from DreamWorks?
The things that I try to keep in mind and that we always focus on and try to remind ourselves is that we need to tell stories as diverse as they can be, and they need to be very diverse from each other. I think there has to be a universal truth to the story. There needs to be a relatability of the characters and something that an audience, young and old, can see in that character and see themselves in that character. I think those are the things that really, unify our films, is that, our films are about characters that are trying to accomplish things, are trying to find love, are trying to make a difference in the world. I mean, that's, I think, great films, even if it's a simple story, trying to connect with each other, trying to, please their father, trying to be a good parent, whatever the thing is that's in the film, it has to have that universal truth. Even if it's a snail or a dog or an ogre, and because you're telling stories about those types of characters, you need to really, really know what that universal truth is.
Let's talk about the technical advances in the years that you've been working. They really just must have been, given that you've seen them up close, quite awe-inspiring, and I guess continue to be. DreamWorks animations now are all computer animated.
All computer animated, yes.
So can you just describe for us the arc of technological development from when you started, what was available, what was there, and what you've run through and what you're able to use now? Just from a if you can give it a sort of a layperson's perspective. If that's
well, I am a layperson, so
good.
That is, when we started, we were making, in Southern California, we were making hand-drawn animated films, and we had, in The Prince of Egypt, we had some limited computer animated elements, things that were modeled and then texture painted. And those things were done with great care. Like, I remember there'd be a shot that would have like a computer animated basket floating on a computer animated piece of water. This was, Moses going down the Nile. But the water would be, the effect water would be hand drawn over it, and the baby in the basket was hand drawn. I think the combining of the two things was what was so challenging, because registering all those things together was really, really impossible. Now, everything is computer animated, but we still start, many of our artists still start with a simple sketch or a simple drawing or a simple painting. They're just using different tools to do that. So the starting place is still the same, even if the tools are different, but the power of the tools and the speed of the tools and the capability of the tools is what's really, really changed. And I think what it's allowed is it's kind of taking a lot of the barriers off of what you can accomplish with the film. I remember working on films, and some of the hardest things to do in animation are, or used to be, water, fur that reacts to water, clothes with fur. So there's all these things, and I remember being in these meetings, and we'd be and we'd be talking about a scene, like we have all these very complexity meetings and budget meetings, and and there'd be like a scene where two characters would have to hug, and somebody would say, do they really have to touch each other? Like, they have to touch each other. Well, can they just touch each other lightly, so the fur doesn't move? All those things. Now, again, those are still really hard things to do, but they're way less hard. And I think because you don't have to worry about basic things like that anymore, you can tell your story, and if your characters need to have water or fur, or you can tell your story without that being the big thing you're tackling in your movie.
You'll of course get to see the exhibition when it opens, and we're going to speak in a little more detail about the aspects of the exhibition a little later in our conversation. But that's one key thing that you can see in the show is the extraordinary depth and ability of these machines and what the animators can do. And I was speaking to you earlier, Bill, about the fact that clearly your animators must be writing and designing program as they go in order to achieve the outcomes they want.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly in effects and lighting and all of the departments where the effects are actually, they're trying to figure out how to do designed effects. I mean, nothing comes for free in an animated movie. That's the one thing I always want to remind people, is that every single thing is there, whether it's a speck of dust or a ray of light or the flick of a hair or the drop of water or a sound effect. None of it was gotten from just the environment giving it to you. Somebody had to think about it. Somebody had to design it. Somebody had to figure out how to put it in the scene, decide where it goes in the scene, art direct it perfectly, and make sure it tells the story beautifully. And so because of that, sometimes you don't have, that thing doesn't exist on the shelf. You can't just go take it off the shelf and say, oh, we want this character to disappear in this scene magically. We want a beanstalk to grow in a certain way up to the sky. We want a zebra to surf on the water in a certain way. All of these things, somebody has to think about how to make the water behave that way and how to make the zebra behave that way as well. So
I should have asked at the very beginning, how long does one of your movies take to make?
They take a long time. They take probably in the deep production sense, when you're fully in production, they take a minimum of about 3 years.
Of how many people working full time?
About 275 to 350 people over the course of that 3-year period. But then there's probably another easily 2 years before that where you're in development, conceptual development. And that's probably a group of about 80 to 100 people who are designing and building all the characters and the worlds, the storyboard artists, editorial, writers, figuring out what the story is. We try to work with a small group of people for as long a time as possible before then you're, making your movie in production and bringing a much larger crew on to make the film.
You've been talking about some of the problems that the new technology solve, but I've got to pull you up on something that you say in the introduction to the catalogue, where you mention the issue of water and how finally animators can have splashing water, which they couldn't have before. Well, those of us who loved The Sorcerer's Apprentice always thought the splashing water had been pretty much nailed, Bill.
It was perfect. Yeah. We parted the Red Sea in The Prince of Egypt, and I thought that looked pretty good too. So it's more about doing that in the computer. I mean, I think actually what we're trying to do in our films is create computer animated effects and characters that have as artistic an expression as The Sorcerer's Apprentice. We're doing, everything we do is designed. So it is not just water that behaves normally. It's water that some artist thought about and figured out. So I think that's what's hard about it, is making the computer make something that looks painterly or artistic or illustrated.
Well, now that we've brought up Disney, it occurs to me to ask you something that I often ask actors when I'm interviewing them, particularly if they're about to play a very big and significant and well-played role, which is, do they have to get those other performances out of their head in order to get on stage or get on film and do it? Or do they embrace those famous performances? In a sense, as an animator, do you need to get Disney out of your head, or is Disney allowed to intrude? Does Disney have a role, given that, let's agree that that's sort of the mastery of the art?
I mean, I love the Disney movies. I love Pixar films. I go to all the other animated films that come out. I think other people, I think the world compares us to Disney and the world compares us to Pixar more than we probably compare ourselves to them. Even though we work in the same medium, or we're in the same type of filmmaking, I think we are doing things that are also very different than them. So No, I actually think having having people who are, our peers in the industry like Disney and Pixar is fantastic. Every movie they make raises the bar, and hopefully we're doing that for them as well.
That's the diplomatic answer. That's all right. We'll take that. Your boss and DreamWorks co-founder Jeffrey Katzenberg reflected on the limitations of traditional animation in the aftermath of the commercial disappointment of Sinbad. Do you believe a great deal has been lost with the departure of traditional animation?
I mean, I personally miss it because I love it so much myself, and some of the smaller films that come out every year, traditionally animated films, are beautiful films that I love seeing.
They have such a different quality, don't they?
They're very
They have
different.
this sort of, I don't know, the only word I can come up with is sort of this liquidity sort of on the screen.
Yeah, it's amazing that, I mean, I think the computer, in some ways, it fools you into thinking that it's artists don't create it sometimes, depending on how you're looking at it. I think because I know what goes behind it, I appreciate computer animation very, very much and think it's really an art form in its own. But I think the audience seemed to go away from traditional animation, and in big numbers. Now again, I'm not sure we're far enough away from that period of storytelling to go, was it the films that were being made at that time, or did people just move on to something else? But the world is so immersive, and the imagery that people have in their lives on their phone and on their games are so immersive and so significant and so deep and rich. I think in some ways a movie experience needs to give you a reason to go to the movie theater. And I think CG animation in particular for kids, that's the medium that they've grown up with. Not that traditional animation, I think if you could find the right story that could only be told in traditional animation, that's the movie. I'd like to figure that out myself, actually. Like, what is the movie that you couldn't make it in CG? It's only going to be great in 2D. That movie, I think, could be a huge hit. But if you saw a movie in 2D and the whole time you're going, well, why didn't they make it in 3D? It would have been better. That's probably, I think, a bar that, people need to consider.
Well, that's right, and that would be a problem. And Jeffrey Katzenberg has said, of course, that he sees 3D as the future. Anyone who's arguing against 3D, he said a lovely thing, they remind me of the people who are arguing against sound talkies in movies and colour in movies as well. Do you agree? I mean, he was talking, of course, about films as well as animation, that 3D is the way to go now.
He's talking about 3D like stereo films, and we're, I think it's, I mean, for me personally, and we make all of our films in 3D, and our films are available to be seen in 3D or in their traditional 2D format. I think that, like 2 years ago, everyone said, oh, 3D is over. That was happening then. Of course, in a movie like Gravity comes out, and you have to see it in 3D. You must see that movie in 3D. I believe you must see How to Train Your Dragon 2 in 3D, because I think the experience is so unique in 3D. But we really think about our films and our filmmaking process. We're not just, pressing the 3D button at the end and people put the goggles on to watch them. We really think about how do we take the audience into the experience of the film, and we're using the camera and the production design to do that in a very immersive way. So, it's different for different audiences.
What we see in the exhibition, which of course you'll get to see, and it fits in nicely here, is this wonderful moment where you have your animators, they have a room in which they can go and physically play, and they physically act out that scene. Why do they do that?
Well, our animators are actors. I mean, they are the actors, and they are, channeling and embodying the characters. And it's the voice of the voice actor and then the performance of the animator that actually come together with the character design to create the performance. So we have these rooms. They're at both studios where they can shoot video reference. And so there's a great reel downstairs of people doing incredibly foolish things, running around and being chased, or, trying to woo each other or whatever it is. But they're basically doing to a track, the voice track of the actors, the physical performance that then they can use to use as reference for when they're animating the character. All of our animators also have mirrors on their desks. Many of them have mirrors, and so they'll act out in front of the mirror what they're going to do as they're planning out their shots and their scenes. Let's
talk more about the exhibition, and one like this, and particularly the one downstairs, is a curious mixture, it seems to me, of artistry and industry. Is that a meaningful distinction for you anymore? in an industry like yours, in a studio like DreamWorks?
What do you mean by that? I'm not sure I understand that one.
Well, where the technology is perhaps something that's still considered separate from the artistic endeavour, or have the two now merged so completely seamlessly for you?
I think they are. I think the thing about film in particular and animated animation is that it's always been about art and then how to use technology to tell that story. I mean, from the very first animated pieces, I think it was Gertie the Dinosaur. It's one of the very earliest things ever done. And people actually went to a movie theater and saw this moving drawings. And every new evolution in film that's come along has been because technology created finally something that could tell the story in that certain way. I don't think we think of it as separate things anymore because the tools and the technology are so much a part of telling the story.
I think what's also going to be very impressive for the visitor, though, is that despite all the technology in the world, so much of the work in the exhibition still starts with at least ink on paper or pencil on paper, paint, brush and wash.
Yep.
These tools are still absolutely the heart of what you do.
It is. There, one of our directors, Simon Wells, who directed The Prince of Egypt, he actually had a quote of his that I'll remember forever, because sometimes there are moments where technology is trying to say, oh, we could make this great thing, this great tool for you, and he'll say, the fastest way for me to get the idea out of my head is with a pencil and a piece of paper. And sometimes you need that. Now, again, the pencil might be a stylus and the paper might be a Cintiq pad, or it might be Photoshop and a paintbrush there. But I think ultimately that's what the exhibition really shows, is that whatever your medium is, whatever your tool is, there's just that spark of that drawing, that painting that actually starts it all.
The exhibition breaks down into three key elements: character, story, and world. Tell us about those three elements and how they work together in the production of one of your films.
Well, when we were talking with Acme about the exhibition itself, our team at DreamWorks and the team at Acme were trying to figure how do we tell the story of how our films are made. I don't know that anybody would have been excited about just a very linear movie by movie, here's the history of our studio approach. That's not represented down there really at all. All films are represented, all 29 of our films are down there, but it was more about the I kind of refer to them as those lightning rod moments, or those lightning rod decisions that get made on a movie that lead to the film that you see in the movie theater. And breaking it down into the world that gets created, the story you're telling, and the characters that get created really was a way of actually trying to illustrate how, by a lot of trial and error sometimes, or by a lot of looking for different brainstorming or collaboration, you find that thing that becomes the scene that you saw in the film. And so looking at it from a character perspective, both design and animation and the creation of a character, the world, how the world comes together in such an incredible way, especially when nothing, again, it has to be all imagined by our artists, or storytelling, brainstorming. I think it was just a really good way of showing that it's how multi-disciplines come together to find those moments.
Let's talk about a couple of the films in detail. As a Wallace and Gromit fan, I've got to ask about your team's experience of stop motion animation. What was that like?
Well, I was very fortunate to be working with the Aardman team. When we were working with them, we made Chicken Run, Wallace and Gromit, and Flushed Away with them. And the Aardman, the team at Aardman are so creative. They are, animation is a painstaking frame by frame process. And computer animation is incredibly challenging, and traditional animation is incredibly challenging. But what they do, that kind of animation truly is frame by frame, and watching them work and watching the kind of artistry, that very detailed artistry that goes into that, it's very specific. So I got to actually spend a lot of time in Bristol with the Aardman team, but again, it's the same. Everything else is the same. The storytelling part of it's the same. The storyboarding part's the same. The character design part, all that is the same. It's just when it comes time to shoot it, it's a very, very different execution.
There's a figure, I think, in the catalogue, which I can't recall, about a solid day's work will net you how many seconds of the film?
Like 4 seconds or something. Yeah, nothing. Yeah, very, very. And back then, this was before, they have these playback machines on Chicken Run. You could, if you didn't shoot it right, you could lose the whole day's work. I
Really?
mean, we have quite a lot of control in computer animation. We can make changes quite late. I mean, it's always expensive, but you could shoot the entire scene and there was something wrong with one piece of the light. And when you would play it back at the end of the day, because they didn't have instant playback back when we made Chicken Run and Wallace and Gromit, that's how much the tools have changed.
That's exhausting. Is Nick Park a nutcase or a genius?
He is a nutcase and a genius.
Okay. Seems about right to me. I know that the Croods is particularly important to you as an animation achievement. Talk to us about the prehistoric world that you wanted to create there.
Well, The Croods was was a film that initially we started developing with Aardman. And it has a very interesting journey. It's a film that took, 10 years to make it to the screen. When we were developing films with Aardman, we had talked about wanting to do we were very interested in doing a caveman movie. They were interested in cavemen, and so we developed a film for a while. The original idea came from John Cleese, and Kirk D'Amico, who then was the writer and co-director with Chris Sanders, was on board from the very beginning. And then when our relationship with Aardman was finished and we went forward and we had transitioned to a computer animated studio at that point, there was just always something about that story, that family, the challenge of telling a story about essentially how do you keep your family together in a world that's changing really fast. That was the proposition of the Croods, because we were experiencing ourselves, we're talking about technology, how quick technology is changing the world and how far ahead kids are than where adults are. And so really ultimately it's a story about how this father just wants his family to stay together in a world that's changing around him. And so you take that story, which is a very, I think, universal story, you put it in a made-up caveman time when the world is literally changing, like breaking under his feet. And that was the opportunity of the Croods. We knew we didn't want it to be a literal time. We wanted to make our own Croodacious period. Yes. And so it was really about inventing a world that had never been seen. And that world is a character in the story as well.
It's interesting to read the catalogue for the exhibition, and some working on the team talk about the fantastic opportunity of creating entirely a new world, but also the difficulty of that, because there are no limits, and sometimes you actually need those limits in order to contain the endeavour itself.
Yeah, I think that was, of the challenges we faced on the Croods, and we had several along the way. I mean, it was a very, very, I would say all of our films all the films that I think people know from DreamWorks that they love, there was a moment on all of them that felt like we might not make that movie because we got to that moment. On the Croods, we had many challenges, but that was definitely one of them, because in a made-up world, everything is possible. Everything is an option. So you spend a lot of your time going, well, it could be this, and it could be that, and it could be, or maybe, so
and you lose your coherence.
You really do lose. So it took a while to find that spine and find that center, but I think the result is really fantastic.